great pleasure for us to be here to this special event that we organized jointly with the Israeli Embassy in Athens, Athens Macedonia News Agency, and the Israeli Embassy in Athens. For us, it's a very, very important moment because we host in Athens distinguished journalists from Israel. I would like to say the famous journalist from Haaretz, Mr. Aluf Ben. Mr. Ben, thank you very much for coming here. There will be a discussion with a prominent journalist, Mr. Kapopoulos from Ethnos, Mr. Angelopoulos from Athens Macedonia News Agency, and Mr. Zirganos from Εφημερίδα των Συντακτών. Also, there will be some remarks from Mr. Nicholas Vathiliadis, is the diplomatic and foreign news editor from Antenna TV, and Mr. Fanis Papathanasiou from ERT, the public Greek television. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Dear sir, please, who can listen to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'll start with very short remarks about how things are seen from the Israeli standpoint, regionally, strategically, and a little bit domestically, and then we can just open it up and you pitch me with whatever. Well, I think we entered a period of higher uncertainty in Israel, both domestically and externally. Domestically, there's only one major question towering above every other issue in Israel today, and that is the longevity of Prime Minister Netanyahu's term in office. For the past 9 years, he's been the center of gravity of the political system in Israel, to the extent that in not one single opinion poll that I'm aware of conducted in Israel in the past 9 years, the respondents were able to identify a challenger, someone else that Israelis would prefer to be the prime minister over Netanyahu. Even when his party was lagging behind in his polls, when the question was asked about who should be the prime minister, it was, and it still is, Netanyahu and a couple of dwarfs changing over time. And the last night's poll conducted by our Channel 2 News indicated no difference. And that's despite a criminal investigation that has been proceeding against Netanyahu in the past year, with already the police and the prosecutors have signed state witness deals with 3 former aides of Netanyahu. But he pledged to keep going. His supporters argue that this is a politically motivated investigation. Clearly, there are serious suspicions of corruption, both in terms of personal graft and in terms of trying to get more favorite newspaper and the news site coverage in return for government favors like easier regulation, favorite regulation for the national telecom that owns one of the major news sites. So this is pending, and the big question is, would Netanyahu call a snap election before any decision on pending indictment? According to the polls, he's going to win the snap election again, which obviously strengthened his position vis-a-vis an indictment, arguing that if the public re-elected him despite these allegations, then this could act as a further deterrent against prosecution, or improve his situation for any bargain with the prosecutors. So this is the only serious political issue that's debated in Israel. Otherwise, there's the usual give and take in a coalition government, with the far right trying to push Netanyahu to implement its agenda of reducing the power of the judiciary, further delegitimizing critics of the Israeli occupation and settlements in the West Bank, etc. And other forces within the coalition who again are afraid of a snap election because, according to the polls, they're about to lose, are trying to persuade Netanyahu not to go all the way further to the right, but to remain somewhere more in the center. But the underlying issue and the underlying motive of everybody is around the investigation. Now, for several years now, Israel enjoyed, for at least a couple of years, more or less a quiet period in terms of the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. There were very few terrorist attacks. To the extent there were attacks, they were mostly concentrated around the settlements and not in Israel proper. And the military has been able to contain violence most of the time quite effectively. In the Syrian front, for 7 years now, Israel has tried to stay away from the chaos in Syria and to reduce, unlike the other neighbors of Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan and Iraq, that are far more deeply involved in the civil war in Syria, either by supporting some of the militias or by taking refugees, which was still is a heavy burden on Jordan and Lebanon, or fighting directly there like the Lebanese Hezbollah. Israel has tried to focus its interest in Syria in two issues. One is avoiding a spillover of the war to the Israeli border through balance of deterrence vis-a-vis the Assad forces and humanitarian and other support to cross-border militias to create a de facto security zone along the border. And the other interest was to try and block by force, by bombings, using air power, to block arms transfers from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah, which is Israel's main conventional adversary today in the region. Mostly these arms shipments involved more precise rocket and missile guidance systems and more sophisticated air and anti-ship missile defense systems. This has changed somewhat in recent months. Well, and obviously 2.5 years ago, the Russian deployment or invasion, anyway you want to call it, in Syria changed the balance of power in the region dramatically. We have a global military superpower across the border with a very sophisticated air defense system that could track any aircraft taking off from any airfield in Israel. And clearly this is something that any Israeli leader or military planner should take into account. For about 2 years, Netanyahu used to travel to Russia to meet President Putin every other month or so. In recent months, this has changed. We see growing concern in Israel over possible Iranian deployment along the border, either directly or through pro-Iranian Shiite militias or through deployment of Hezbollah contingent. With the fear in Israel is that, to turning our northern border, not just to the border with Hezbollah and all the thousands and thousands of rockets and missiles, to be deployed not just in Lebanon, but also in Syria. So to open another front controlled by Iran against Israel, kind of a Shiite-dominated crescent stretching from Iran through Iraq, Syria, all the way to Lebanon and the Mediterranean. And Israeli leaders made clear that this is a casus belli for Israel and that Israel would do anything to stop and to prevent this Iranian deployment. And matters came to a head twice in the past 2 or 3 months. The first was an attack by or infiltration by an Iranian drone into Israeli airspace, which eventually led to Israeli counterattack of the airfield in Syria where this drone came from. Syrian air defenses were able to shoot down an Israeli F-16 jet fighter over Israeli territory. And I think this was the first time when this mostly off-the-record war in Syria came to be front-page story for the Israeli media and came home to most Israelis who were otherwise either ignorant or careless about what was going on across the border because there was no There was no overt Israeli price to pay, there were no casualties, there was no damage to property or to military systems. And then, a couple of weeks ago, Israel attacked an Iranian deployment in the same air base in Syria, killing several Iranians, including a colonel, and destroying some weapon systems there. Apparently, more drones or drone guidance systems and some air defense system. And for the first time, Iran, rather than looking the other way or not acknowledging it, acknowledged that it lost some personnel in Syria and threatened Israel with retaliation. We're still waiting to see if and when this is happening. This will happen, but clearly that the Iranian-Israeli tension in Syria is now much more in the open. And this is something that wasn't there in the past 7 years, or even ever before. We never faced, there were Israeli threats in the past to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, but that never happened. And Iran never acknowledged, in the past, never acknowledged that it deployed military personnel in Syria to face Israel. And the relationship with Russia also deteriorated because Russia issued 2 warnings to Israel to stop violating Syrian sovereignty, again, which it didn't do in the past. In the past, Israel and Russia had a very effective coordination mechanism, a kind of hotline between operation centers with Israeli Russian-speaking officers calling their Russian counterparts in Syria and telling them, look out the window and you're going to see some missiles coming, and or go hide in the next 10 minutes if you don't want to get hurt. Apparently, this coordination mechanism is now in trouble, and the Russians yesterday announced that they are willing to supply Syria with more sophisticated air defense systems. So we have much higher tension over the northern border. That coincides, not surprisingly, with the President Trump's declaration of his intention to withdraw the remaining American forces. I think a couple of thousand people in Syria were sent there to fight ISIS. Now with ISIS, the caliphate more or less defeated, he wants to recall them back home. And again, this creates more vacuum, more Russian influence, more Iranian influence, more possible trouble for Israel, but also more a wider freedom of action window for Israel, because you don't have to take into account possible retaliation against these Americans. But it leads to further instability. And that's the northern front. Southern front, the Palestinians, after a long time of, as I said, relative quiet, with very sparse acts of violence, not centrally coordinated in any way, they declared what they called the March of Return from Gaza towards their non-existing pre-1948 villages in Israel. And for several weekends now, every Friday, thousands of Palestinians march towards the border fence to be met with Israeli sniper fire that cost, I think, about 3,000 casualties altogether by now. And they're building up towards a major confrontation on May 15, which is the day when the Palestinians commemorate the Nakba, their defeat in 1948, their exile from Palestine. A day before, the American government will move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, for the first time recognizing Israel de jure as Israel's capital, Jerusalem as Israel's capital after 70 years, which again inflames reaction from the Palestinians. And all this led one of our distinguished military thinkers, General Yadlin, the former head of intelligence and a famed Air Force pilot, to say that this is the most dangerous month of May since 1967, when in the month of May, the crisis led to the 67 war. Now, I'm not saying that war is imminent, but clearly it's much higher tension, which again reflects on the political scene, because if you have military tension in 2 fronts, in the south and the north, the public tends to align behind the veteran, experienced prime minister rather than seek his ouster. So politically, this puts Netanyahu in a better position to lead the country and to stay on as prime minister despite his criminal and political problems. And higher uncertainty and possible explosion and an effort to mitigate and to avoid another war or another Palestinian Intifada or some other crisis in the Middle East. This is more or less where we are at this point.
Shalom Aluf, welcome to Athens. Before entering the main issues, I think it should be proper to let us know a little bit about Haaretz, about how Haaretz remains an independent journal in the whole region, how is to be a very influential, independent media in this very difficult part of the world, and how Haaretz survives in this very difficult media and political environment.
First of all, thanks for the compliments. Haaretz is the oldest news outlet in the Hebrew language. We're about to celebrate our 100th anniversary next year. Actually, the first forerunner edition of Haaretz it was issued 100 years ago this month as part of the Jewish battalions in the British Army occupying Palestine at the time from the Ottomans. Haaretz is the voice of liberalism in Israel, and it follows very long-held editorial policy which favors diplomacy over war, which favors the peace process and reaching peace with the neighbors over holding territory, which opposes occupation and settlements, both for practical but also very much from a moral perspective. And economically, Haaretz used to be the voice of free market in Israel when the economy was owned by the state and trade unions, and it was a socialist country for practical purposes. When the socialist system was replaced by a privatized tycoon system, Haaretz, in our business paper, The Marker, opposed the taikunization of Israel, based on the same principle that monopolies are bad for the public, and that free market with competition is the best way for the wider population, and not just for few people or few unions or few political bosses who are calling the shots or making exorbitant profits at the expense of the wider public. Religion, very important, maybe the most important public issue at any state in the Middle East, stretching from Turkey to Iran, through Israel and Egypt, all the way to Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. Again, Haaretz has always supported freedom from religion and freedom of religion. And in Israel, we don't have separation of religion and state. So again, this is not necessarily a mainstream position, but we are the voice of secularism in Israel. Although we give respect to religion and we publish texts about the Bible and about the Torah and so on, like the others. And last but not least, we are the voice of highbrow culture in Israel. We just published a story in our literary section about an unknown play by Yehuda Amichai, one of Israel's poet laureates. And it appeared that 50 years ago, there were about 10 competing theater critics in the Israeli newspapers that existed at the time. Today, only one newspaper has regular column for theater review, and that is Haaretz. We are the only ones covering classical music, dance. We have one book review section and one literary section that publishes both poems and critical reviews, and historic essays and philosophical essays. And this also is a unique voice in Israel. It wasn't like that 20, 30, 40 years ago, but the mainstream media, where we're missing, we're giving much less coverage to reality television, which is the main story in the mainstream media. Now, where does it put us politically vis-a-vis the current situation? We are an opposition voice to the Netanyahu right-wing government. We oppose their efforts to reduce civil liberties, reduce the importance and the ability of the Supreme Court to defend minority rights, to defend these civil liberties. We support a more egalitarian society and more equality to the Arabic-speaking minority in Israel. And we oppose the occupation and settlements. Where we're getting ourselves occasionally into trouble with our own readers is when we criticize the conduct of military affairs, of military operations by the IDF from a moral perspective. And it came to a head in the last war in Gaza 4 years ago when we published a very critical article about the morality of Air Force bombings of civilian targets in Gaza, and we were met by a couple of thousands of our subscribers canceling their subscriptions in protest. And unlike similar incidents in the past, and that actually began in 1982 when Israel, in the first Lebanon war. Since then, most wars that Israel was engaged in or involved with happened in civilian areas, either in Lebanon or in the West Bank or in Gaza. And when you're fighting in the civilian areas, you have problems. You have civilians getting hurt in the way. And we have the usual call for restraint and for thinking twice and 10 times before acting in civilian areas. This is not a mainstream position in Israel, and occasionally it gets us into trouble with our readers. But we believe that the proper timing for raising these concerns is when the war is fought. Otherwise, it's what we call in Israel shooting and crying. After the war is over, then you do soul searching and you say we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have done that, which is the more mainstream position. And even that is less so in recent years, especially since the Second Palestinian Intifada and the campaign of suicide bombings in the main streets and shopping malls and bus lines in Israeli cities. So this is more or less where we are journalistically, politically, and how we survive. There are enough people who want to read Haaretz and pay for it, and there are enough advertisers who want to advertise in Haaretz. And as long as that's the case, like any other newspaper, we can remain independent. Look, financial independence is the key to press freedom. Otherwise, you're owned by someone who could be the most liberal person, but then you still belong to them.
I would like to focus on President Trump's Middle East policy, how it is perceived in Israel. Do you see any contradiction between the main target of the main priority of Trump policy in the Middle East, which is to put more pressure to Iran, and withdraw United States consent from the agreement of 6 powers, and at the same time the confusion created, we are leaving Syria very soon. How you can pretend that you want to control the expansion of Iran influence in the Middle East and at the same time create confusion by telling that I am leaving Syria?
Well, it's difficult to predict President Trump, as you know, but you see 2 streaks in American policy in the Middle East. One is continuity. The outsourcing of Syria to Russia began by President Obama. The deep sentiment of calling back the troops and being less interventionist abroad is a direct outcome of the less than successful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that this is common to both Democrats and Republicans in America. There's very little appetite for another war, let alone another war in the Middle East. And I think that Trump's efforts to engage North Korea are part of that as well, to reduce the footprint of America's military interventions abroad. The other is kind of a more radical approach to change American foreign policy from the Obama years. And clearly you could see a switch of alliances. You cannot call Obama's dialogue with Iran an alliance, but mostly because the Iranian leadership would not go all the way towards detente with America, and because Obama was restrained by Congress, by others in America, would not let him go all the way, like to do a Nixon to China sort of opening to Tehran. But Trump switched back America's alliance to Saudi Arabia, a more traditional American approach since the late 70s, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And once again, Iran is the adversary. How do you reconcile these two streaks? Calling back the troops from Syria and getting out of the agreement with Iran. So, you know, from a military point of view, are these soldiers in Syria, or is this residual force in Syria a real counterweight to Iran? Or you have better means to... I agree. But from Israeli standpoint, the Israeli leadership and security leadership and so on is very well aware of the American withdrawal from the region, which entails both higher risks to Israel, but also more freedom of action. Because when the Americans are there, Israel should, in anything that Israel does across the border, it should take into account that Americans might get hurt. And the last thing that any Israeli leader would want to hear was that Americans were hurt because they were defending Israel, or even worse, as kind of collateral damage because of some clash that Israel has with a neighbor, or with Hezbollah, or with whoever. And also this American withdrawal has drawn the Sunni regimes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, Jordan, Egypt, closer towards a tacit military and security alliance with Israel. Now, we don't really know what's really going on between Israel and Saudi Arabia, but, you know, being diplomatic correspondent for many years, I know that what you see on the record usually reflects some deeper action and wider action off the record. And when the Saudi Crown Prince goes to America to meet the Jewish leadership there and to speak about Israel, about joint interests with Israel, and when the Saudis allow Air India to overfly their territory for the first time en route from Delhi to Ben Gurion Airport, it means that something is going on. And I think that to both Israel and Saudi Arabia, the current Israeli government and the current Saudi government, this kind of tacit alliance is easier politically than an open alliance. Why? Because an open alliance means that Israel must pay with some concession, with something to give the Palestinians, and something considerable, not just saying nice words about Mahmoud Abbas or what have you, or allowing, I don't know, 10,000 more Palestinians work permits in Israel. This means serious steps that would be seen everywhere towards Palestinian statehood. This would mean territorial changes or changing the internal boundaries in the West Bank. This is something that's politically impossible for the right-wing government in Israel to do. And for the Saudis, any open alliance with Israel without more freedom to the Palestinians is also politically impossible. So it's very convenient to both Netanyahu and MBS and President Assisi and the Jordanian king to conduct all this in secret, with the rest of the world more or less understanding what's going on. And again, this is a byproduct of the American withdrawal, with Trump supporting it. Now, the biggest victory, now Obama was not a very popular president in Israel, by both sides of the political aisle. The right-wingers hated Obama because they saw him as hopelessly pro-Palestinian. And now when he's out of office, the right-wing media in Israel is portraying him as one of the enemies, the historic enemies of the Jewish people, along with Pharaoh and even worse. I think this is an exaggeration. President Obama has given Israel the largest ever security aid package. President Obama, when Israelis got into trouble, actual trouble, intervened on behalf of Israel to assist us. And not just me, but our security establishment, again, contrary to the Prime Minister, the leaders of Israel's security organs and intelligence community supported the JCPOA deal with Iran because they saw it as a better means to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions than going to war. They opposed the Prime Minister and then Defense Minister Netanyahu and Barak when they were trying to recruit them to attack Iran. So you can't argue that Obama was really an enemy of the Jewish people, but to the right-wingers, since he supported Israel's withdrawal from the West Bank, end of settlement activity, and the creation of independent Palestine, this was anathema. But Obama was also disliked by the Israeli left wing, by those who supported the two-state solution, because to us, he was incompetent, giving high speeches about peace, but doing very little to promote it, delegating authority for peace negotiations to retirees like Mitchell and John Kerry, not intervening himself. And the only thing when he actually intervened was in the last moment, this transition period, allowing Security Council Resolution 2334 to pass, supporting Palestinian statehood. But when this happened, I wrote a piece asking, are you coming now? When you could actually implement it for 8 years, you're doing it now when you know you're powerless to do anything beyond these empty words. So Trump had a much better reception in Israel than elsewhere because of this dislike of his predecessor. To the right-wingers, he is the new Messiah, the new supporter of the Jewish people, like King Cyrus in the Bible. And the right-wing media compared his decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem to the Cyrus Declaration, which allowed the Jews to come back to Palestine from their exile in Babylonia in the last chapters of the Bible. And I think this is exaggeration, but it is a diplomatic coup for Israel because it's going to take a while, but others will follow suit eventually after the Americans. Currently, only the Guatemalan government has declared its intention to move the embassy to Jerusalem, but I think it's not going to be the last one. And if Netanyahu was afraid that this would entail some quid pro quo, some American demand to do, or some American consolation prize to the Palestinians, this has yet to happen. And the big question is whether Trump is squarely in the supporting everything that the Israeli right-wing government says or does. Not necessarily. For example, Trump made public his resistance to settlement expansion. Which is politically convenient for Netanyahu to respond to right-wing pressures from the far right to expand the settlement, to say, I need to give it to Trump. It's not me, I would have built thousands and thousands of new houses in the settlements, but I have to obey President Trump, who's such a great friend of the Jewish people, that I must give him this small favor. And we're waiting to see the Trump peace plan, which is every other week or so, the administration keeps promising to put forward to the ultimate deal to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, we're still waiting. But again, from an Israeli left-wing perspective, the only good point here is that unlike Obama, Trump faces no serious opposition. But by just like Netanyahu in Israel, if Netanyahu decides to turn left and move forward in a future peace process, he would enjoy 80% support among the Israeli public. So Trump is better positioned to ask for Israeli concessions than Obama. But so far, he shows no serious intention to get involved in this direction. And it remains to be seen whether this peace plan actually comes about and under what circumstances. In the past, most of these peace plans were usually byproduct or derivative of some superpower relations. You know, going back to the Balfour Declaration as part of the First World War, and last but not least, the Bush Roadmap, which was part of the paving the road towards the Iraq War. So the Trump peace plan could eventually be and probably would be linked to some wider move in the Middle East. Like I'm withdrawing, but I'm leaving you with a blueprint to change regional dynamics, which would help relieve some of the pressure off the Sunni regimes if they could appear to be those who give the Palestinians more freedom. This would improve their situation vis-a-vis their public opinion. But so far it's just phony baloney, it's up in the air.
I want to remain to the Palestinian question and ask you if there is really any other solution, an alternative solution than the two-state solution. I mean, we can all agree that is it impossible to implement now the two-state solution? And if yes, what else is it possible to be accepted by the Palestinians?
I don't think it's impossible. It's always been difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. You know, we've made even more impossible things in the past. I do think it's difficult practically and politically because, as far from the Palestinian point of view, they are dealing with an Israeli right-wing government committed to full control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and settlement expansion. While from the Israeli point of view, the Palestinians are divided between a totally hostile Hamas in Gaza that is not willing to accept Israel in any way or form, and that for the past 11 years was willing to accept to live under blockade rather than make even baby steps towards recognition and reconciliation with Israel. And with this group also seeking to control the Palestinian society in the West Bank and not just in Gaza. And a weak Palestinian Authority under President Abbas, who is not getting younger and will probably leave office in the foreseeable future with no clear successor mechanism. Look, in Israel we also don't know who would and who could succeed Netanyahu, but we trust our institutions to pave the way towards an easy succession, as happened many times in the past. In the Palestinian Authority, we have no idea who even might come forward and how to succeed President Abbas. So as far as most Israelis are concerned, we're in the situation that we call in Israel no partner for a peace deal. And we don't have the external partners, the Americans, the Europeans, others, who would push that forward. So you're asking about other solutions. The idea of a unified state, of a more egalitarian state, either by Israel naturalizing, offering Israeli citizenship to all Palestinians in the West Bank, leaving Gaza aside for the moment, and living with a 40-45% Arabic-speaking minority, integrating two economies with about tenfold difference in GDP per capita, with decades and decades of hatred and violence. This appears to me, you know, it's a nice theoretical idea if you write, you know, the second book of Isaiah about you know, the wolf and the sheep living together, but the way we see it in Israel is the wolf and the sheep living together is that you can do it by bringing a new sheep every day to the cage, and therefore. But I must acknowledge that if this idea was, you know, I remember when I took over the opinion section editing the opinion section in Haaretz 9 years ago, I started getting these one-state op-eds from people both in the far right and the far left, putting the Israeli political spectrum not as linear but as kind of circular, with the extremes on both ends suggesting the same solution, even for different reasons. it's crawling closer to the center. So you have, for example, we just ran 2 large pieces by Aleph Bet Yoshua, one of Israel's most prominent, well-known novelists, suggesting his formula for one-state idea, arguing that 2-state is impossible, not just from a practical point of view, but also because of the different, very basic perspectives of the conflict and of nationality by both sides. And then you have the middle way, which is what Netanyahu and his supporters call prolonging the status quo, avoiding unilateral steps, Israeli unilateral steps on either side, either unilateral withdrawals like Sharon did in Gaza 13 years ago, because that entails domestic rift, that entails major break with the settlers and their supporters, or unilateral steps in the other direction, with the far-right suggestion, which is now also approved by the central body of Likud, of the ruling party, for formal annexation, if not of the entire West Bank, but at least of those areas that under Oslo are still under Israeli control, what we call Area C, where all the settlements and firing grounds of the IDF and the security zones reside. And Netanyahu opposes that as well, because that entails external conflict, both with the Palestinians and with global public opinion and world governments. Even Trump apparently would not sanction Israeli annexation of the West Bank. And therefore, and interestingly, the main opposition parties in Israel support the same idea. Because unlike the right-wing parties, they support the two-state solution in principle, but then they say, the leaders of the Labour Party and Yesh Atid, the Lapid Party, say that two-state solution is a great idea, but we need to wait 10, 15 years until we start negotiating it, which is basically saying, keep the status quo going. And the status quo so far has been very convenient to Israelis. It allows Israel has been able to prosper economically and to enjoy, as I said, more or less security, quiet and stability for several years now. By and large, for the past 13 years on the Israeli side, since the end of the Second Intifada, without giving up an inch. And to Netanyahu, his claim to fame vis-a-vis his voter base is, look, I've been in power for 9 years. Yes, I never annexed anything and I don't build like crazy in the settlements. But look, I didn't give up an inch, didn't even offer to give up an inch, and blocked any suggestion of serious peace process till now. So you have to trust me because I know how to maneuver and I know how, using this Fabian strategy of avoiding direct conflict with the Palestinians, with global public opinion, with foreign governments, and with the settlers, let me maneuver. I know how to handle them.
Yes, but Palestinian division is also very convenient to Netanyahu. I mean, as long as Palestinians remain, not only geographically, of course, it's inevitable, but politically also.
But it's not just convenient, it's the official Netanyahu policy. Whenever the Hamas and Fatah reached reconciliation deals that have always been derailed, but the moment they announce anything in that direction, Netanyahu uses whatever public stage appears that day to say that Israel would never accept it, that this is a terrorist takeover of the Palestinian Authority, and that President Abbas is a terrorist. Look, this is there's true to Middle East, true to form and to character in the Middle East. Israel and Abbas could say the worst things about each other in diplomatic forums, but then allow their security forces to have the best coordination on the ground, facing the common enemy, Hamas. So there's always, in the Middle East, there's always more to what you see. Your enemy is sometimes your best friend. For example, when ISIS was there with the caliphate in Syria, the forces that protected Israel, that fought ISIS, and prevented them to spill over towards the Israeli border, were Hezbollah and Assad and Iran. And both Hezbollah and Israel had a very common, strong interest to prevent any clashes along the Israeli-Lebanese border. Or in other words, Israel never tried to use Hezbollah's involvement in Syria to try and improve its position along the Lebanese border beyond keeping it quiet. So you have all these frenemy situations in the Middle East all the time, and especially between Israel and Abbas. Well, Abbas, Abbas is not a terrorist. Abbas, even when it was not a very popular position among the Palestinians and the Fatah leadership, always opposed use of terror as a political tool because he thought that the Palestinians would eventually pay a much higher price fighting a stronger power, Israel, if they do that, and he always favored diplomacy. But that doesn't turn him into a Zionist or a pro-Israeli leader. But it doesn't mean that, and he has his occasional outbursts of very critical positions against Israel and Zionism. For example, his demand from the British government to cancel the Balfour Declaration, to take it back, countered by Netanyahu's effort to hug the British government and praise the Balfour Declaration and commemorate its 100th anniversary several months ago, and going to meet Theresa May and forcing the British into a kind of diplomatic tightrope around it. But by and large, he has been a partner to Israel. And after him, there's no idea, the best, the top security experts and officials I've spoken to in the Israeli government have no idea what would happen after Abbas and how.
You referred to Netanyahu policy as an indirect message to his electoral base. I don't give an inch. Is there a widespread impression in the electoral base of Netanyahu that time is working for Israel?
It's a good question. You know why? Because Israeli leaders, and Netanyahu first and foremost, are desperately repeating that message that we've never been as strong as we are today. And this is usually where my red light starts flashing, because this is exactly what the Golda Meir government was saying in 1973 when it was facing an election, and ignoring the warning signs that Egypt was less than happy with the rejection of its peace efforts and prepared a war which was devastating to Israel. I mean, militarily Israel defeated the Egyptian and Syrian armies, but eventually it had to withdraw from the Sinai, and it lost a generation of young people who were either killed or maimed by this war, physically and mentally. The path of economic growth of Israel, when you look at the graph of economic growth of Israel and productivity, the 73 war is a turning point. We were never able to close the gap of lost GDP due to that war. And so whenever Israelis leaders are trying to convince us that we've never been better, you better start worrying. And but the voter base, regardless of that, the voter base trusts Netanyahu that he would do whatever he could to avoid territorial concessions. And true to form, look, Netanyahu has never been a kind of mainstream politician. He never appealed to the mainstream. And I heard the story from Avi Gil, was the former Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and for 28 years, closest aide to Shimon Peres. And when Peres was state president and Avi was his informal diplomatic advisor, he said that once he went to see Netanyahu and told him, Mr. Prime Minister, I can show you polling data showing that if you follow through with the peace process and work toward two-state solution, 80% of Israelis would support you, or 70% or whatever. Netanyahu said, okay, show me the data. He read the data, and then he raised his head and said to Avi Gil, Avi, in that case, would you vote for me? And Avi said, well, I was thinking very hard, but I could not say yes. And that explained to me why Netanyahu is so insisting on catering his voter base rather than going on fishing expeditions. And to him, the formative experience was that in the first term, under strong American pressure, he went to Y plantation near Washington, and after 9 days of negotiating with President Clinton and Yasser Arafat, they signed a deal of further implementation of Oslo and further transfer of land in the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority. And Netanyahu was sure that he would be met with general applause on the way back. What happened was that the far right toppled his government, and the center left, the opposition, used the opportunity to oust him rather than give him a network, what we call safety net, to stay in power. And that taught him that you need to trust your base and not go on fishing expeditions towards those who dislike you. And now when he got into his criminal problems, again in the past, when Sharon and Olmert faced the same situation, they broke to the left. And Sharon withdrew from Gaza, and Olmert offered a very generous peace plan to Abbas, and even negotiated, in his final days, even negotiated peace with Syria. Netanyahu went the other way, to solidify his credentials with the right wing, and even threatened the satellite parties of Likud with electoral defeat if there's a snap election. So yes, the voter base gets the message. Even if they don't think the time is working in Israel's favor, they don't see an alternative. So the alternative is, to wait out the Palestinians until they're tired of fighting Israel.
Just a remark, not a question. I remember 2 or 3 months before the October 73 war, and because of the optimism we never were better, there was in the Foreign Affairs Review an article written by George Ball, a former Under-Secretary of President Johnson, about the need to put pressure on Israel for a solution, and the title of the article was How to Save Israel in Spite of Herself.
Yeah, but the more important thing was that in June, 4 months before the 73 war, President Nixon hosted Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, in San Clemente, in California, and at 3 a.m., Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, asked Kissinger to wake up the president and to have an urgent late-night, early hours meeting with Brezhnev, in which Brezhnev told him, look, the Egyptians and Syrians are going to war against Israel. They're not willing to wait any longer for any meaningful discussion of borders. And to the best of our knowledge, the Americans either never took this idea seriously, or they didn't pass the message to Israel. And that's why there are those conspiracy theorists in Israel who argue that the war was actually Kissinger's idea of how to use the war to achieve two things. First, to draw Egypt away from the Soviet orbit into the American orbit, which he achieved phenomenally, but also to teach Israel a lesson about the limits of its own power, which was also achieved devastatingly, as I said. But the new generation of Israelis, how many Israelis today live who still remember the 73 war? Most of us were either born afterwards or immigrated to Israel after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the number of people, the relative number of people in Israel who recall that situation is diminishing. Although the Prime Minister did serve in the war as a junior officer, and he does remember that.
Apart the rift between left and right, there is also a rift in the society of Israel between seculars and religious. And I was really astonished when I went the first time to Israel to see the difference between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This rift, I just wonder if it's deep, how important it is, and if this is a real danger for the future for Israeli society. Because religious parties play a very important role in the political scene, and they are mixed up in almost everything today.
Well, first of all, the rift is the basic dilemma and conundrum of Zionism. from its first days with Theodor Herzl and the creation of the Zionist movement in Russia, which built the state. Our national novelist, the Nobel laureate in literature, Shai Agnon, his masterpiece is a novel called Only Yesterday, in which he recalls, it's based on his own recollection of being a young pioneer in Palestine in the final Ottoman years in 1906. And the protagonist begins his journey in Jaffa, in the first days of Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew metropolis. And it depicts very, young people, free love, going to the beach, having drinks together, and so on. And then the protagonist moves to Jerusalem, an old city ruled by a very strict rabbi with strict enforcement of the ultra-Orthodox way of life. And amazingly, and Agnon wrote the book in the early 1940s, under the British mandate. And amazingly, you could read it as description of Israel today, despite the fact that by that time there were maybe 40,000 Jews in Palestine. And the dream of a Jewish state was phony baloney in 1906. And this is the basic dilemma of Zionism. How do you reconcile, what does it mean to be a Jewish state in secular terms? And now, the religious have more children. They start having families when they're 18. So the growth rate of ultra-Orthodox schools in Israel is 4% annually, while secular schools are stable. Arabic language schools grow, and modern Orthodox, national religious, Zionist religious schools grow. The school system are the separate school systems are the only official indicator of different parts of Israeli society. So the Arabic-speaking society and the national religious grow by 1.2% annually. So society is becoming more religious. And by the way, the same dilemmas you can see in the Israeli non-Jewish society as well. One more women in Israel wear the hijab. And you see more hijabs in public spaces, not just in Arab towns and villages, but also in Tel Aviv. And this is unprecedented. So this is a very basic dilemma. And clearly the country is becoming more religious because you have more religious people who put more demands on the mainstream society, and especially the area of conflict is the freedom of women. In the ultra-Orthodox society, there's total separation. In the modern Orthodox society, growingly so as well. And now there are two debates, whether ultra-Orthodox students in academia should be allowed to study in strictly gender-separated classes, where female professors are not allowed to teach male students. And in the army recruits more religious soldiers, and the religious soldiers and their rabbis demand stricter gender separation. We just published a story yesterday about the new bid by the military to buy higher fences to separate men and women in military bases. And we published a story about how the healthcare providers in Israel are trying to recruit the growing ultra-Orthodox clientele by avoiding the presence of women in medical conferences and using different language and so on and so forth. So this is a major issue in Israeli society. But the counterforce here is that when you look at it, despite the demographic growth of the Orthodox society, the number of members of Knesset from religious parties today more or less equals the number of members of Knesset from religious parties 70 years ago. So there is a quiet move from religious life to secular life, and it's not as if the religious society is able to keep everybody under its tent, but it's always a point of tension. And any time in Israel's history when the external borders were more or less quiet, then the religious secular rift came to the fore. In practical life, look, in the Tel Aviv area, the public sphere is much more secular than it used to be when I was a kid, for example, mainly due to the arrival of 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union who were now very secular. At the same time, the secular neighborhoods in Jerusalem are dying out. Despite the efforts of the current mayor to bring secular students and to allow non-kosher restaurants to be open in Jerusalem, secularism in Jerusalem could not take root. So there is this distinction, and most of society is somewhere in the middle, paying respect to different aspects of religion, but as long as it doesn't intervene with their ability to drive or to fly or to have sex whenever they want. In the religious lifestyle, you need to abstain for 2 weeks every month.
We'd like to welcome at least 3 members of the Greek Parliament. Mr. Koumoutsakos, I'm catching him to leaving. Mrs. Avlonitou from Syriza Party, Mrs. Kefalogiannis from New Democracy, and of course Mr. Koumoutsakos. I would like to invite to the panel Mr. Vafiadis to say some remarks and put some questions also.
First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Aluf Ben and to take advantage of his wisdom, trying to broaden the discussion a little bit to other issues of interest in the broader Middle East. I would like to refer to the Kurdish question. After recently Masoud Barzani decided to go for his referendum of independence, the Kurds were put in a corner in a sense. They lost essential land, both in terms of geostrategic importance and financially. Since they controlled Kirkuk, they lost Kirkuk. And also we had the cooperation of Turkey, Iran and Iraq trying to push the Kurds to the limits. And we had also the encouragement of Erdogan to take Afrin and corner the Syrian Kurds. So I would like some more light to be said on the future of the Kurds. Also a very interesting development was the fact that just before the referendum, we saw Kurds waving Israeli flags in their meetings, in their gatherings, showing that there is an Israeli interest and there is also a great expectations from Israel by the Kurdish local societies. Another factor playing strongly in the Middle East right now is Erdogan, the unpredictable president of Turkey, who, despite the fact that already controls Afrin, he wants to go further and claim Manbij, an area where we know that there is the American factor playing a very important role with the presence, or at least a small contingent of American soldiers there. So it would be interesting to shed some more light from the Israeli perspective on those developments. And then also, because it is also particular Greek interest, how's Erdogan doing? Because we had the interesting developments concerning the Israel-Turkey alliance at some point that turned to enmity. And now we have a different balance of power. We have Greece, Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus trying to put together an alliance in terms of the exploitation of natural resources, concerning, the
Natural gas.
The natural gas, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. And please give us some enlightenment on how Israel sees all those piracies of Erdogan in Eastern Mediterranean concerning the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus and the exploitation there. Thank you.
Well, first the Kurdish issue. It's not highly discussed in Israel, the Kurdish issue, but traditionally, and modern Kurdish history is mostly a story of being used as a tool of war fighting or rebellion against by different powers, and then being kicked out. and betrayed. Israel had a very intimate relationship with the Iraqi Kurds back in the 60s and early 70s when they were fighting against the Ba'ath regime in Baghdad. That used to be one of Israel's worst enemies, and Israel and the Shah of Iran collaborated in assisting the Kurds. There's a generation of Israeli officers and Mossad operatives. Now they're all publishing their memoirs. Shabtai Shavid, the former head of Mossad, just published a memoir beginning with his first mission, which was to help the Kurds, and with photos of him and his wife based in Iran and going to visit Barzani or whatever. And then in 1975, the Shah signed a deal with Saddam Hussein, betraying the Kurds, and that cooperation was over. More recently, we know of of Kurdish oil arriving, imported into Israel by ships that disappear in the Mediterranean and then reappear under different names.
Greek ships, you said?
You said. So there is cooperation going on. But at the same time, Israel, and that relates to a second point, Israel has always been very careful not to get involved with Turkish Kurds. Because Israel and Turkish relations, despite the agreement of reconciliation a year and a half ago and the return of ambassadors to Ankara and Tel Aviv, and the flourishing commerce and the second largest airline flying from Ben Gurion is Turkish Airlines, right after our national airline El Al. The political relations, Erdogan is attacking Israel, especially whenever something bad is happening in Gaza. His language is only becoming fierce and fierce against Israel, and the Israeli media and by Israeli politicians is usually depicted as Sultan Erdogan, as the worst enemy of Israel in the region, and so on. But again, separate rhetoric from practice. There are two Turkish red lines that Israel, even in the worst times vis-a-vis Erdogan, was very careful not to cross. One is the Armenian genocide issue. It's April, Armenian Genocide Memorial Day. Every year there are voices in the Israeli political system or public life, and we get op-eds from people suggesting that Israel, with our memories of the Holocaust, must recognize the Armenian genocide. It's stopped by the government, and I don't see it changing. And number two is support for the Turkish Kurds. So Israel accepts the integrity of Turkey, and it's very careful not to cross that line. And if you want to take it to see it in a more strategic framework, in Syria, although Israel and Erdogan support conflicting groups, it's spheres of influence. Israel doesn't care of what Erdogan does in northern Syria, and he is not intervening with what Israel does in southern Syria. So there's no real conflict of interest there. Regarding the natural gas, there were talks between Israel and Turkey over a pipeline, and now there is a kind of draft agreement between Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy to build another pipeline. But you have another important factor here, and that is Egypt, that seeks to be the regional hub of natural gas with liquefying terminal and pipelines. And the dilemma for Israel here is, and Israel is not, Israel's deposits are not big enough to dictate anything. But Egypt is also a very important, if not the most important, strategic partner of Israel in the region. Would Israel go against Egyptian interests? It's a major issue. Regarding the delineation of economic waters, I'm less familiar with the details here, so I don't want to make any uneducated comment.
First, thank you very much, the organizers, for the invitation. Thank you very much, Mr. Aluf-Ben, for the views. I'm now more optimistic, after the event, that this tension in the region will diffuse anytime soon. I will continue with the question that our Dean of War Correspondent, Mr. Nicolas Vafiadis, touched Turkey. The talk of the city is Turkey and Erdogan. So we all try to see how the situation in the broader Middle East region, Syria, the East Mediterranean reflects on Turkey. Many people in Athens, many people in the United States and Europe believe that this Turkey with Erdogan needs a different approach, changing the equilibrium between diplomacy and defense. And we have different incidents in the recent months. So I would like your views. Would you see that this Turkey, this new Turkey, needs a different approach, changing the equilibrium, focusing more on defense? Because so far the Greek foreign policy and the Greek approach towards Turkey is based on diplomacy, highly, and diplomacy based on the international law of order, and not too much in defense. Now, many people in the United States, in Europe, in Athens as well, believe that this new Turkey needs a different approach. It's unpredictable, it's more unpredictable, and they don't see any time soon, not only in the elections in 2 months, that sometime soon after the elections, that this tension with Greece at least, but Turkey, unpredictable Turkey in the region, will diffuse. What is your views?
Well, first of all, I would not dare to give advice to Greek foreign policy makers about how to approach Turkey. It's really, no, seriously, it's beyond my scope of knowledge. I would argue, though, that the rhetoric may be less predictable, and maybe some of the actions are less predictable. But the basic mechanism of Turkish foreign policy that goes back centuries, of playing powers against each other, has not changed. Look, Erdogan had this summit meeting in Ankara with Rouhani and Putin, which apparently puts him, that he switched sides. But then again, he never applied to leave NATO or to tell the Americans to take back their deployment and the nuclear bombs in Incirlik that are there not to defend Turkey. They are there because there's a very big nuclear power north of Turkey. Or in other words, they always try to extract the best from, whenever there's conflict around them, they always try to extract the best from both sides. And I guess this has been the Turkish lesson from their very unsuccessful involvement in the First World War. And this is how they played it in the Second World War, this is how they played in the Cold War, and this is how they play it now. There is conflict in Syria. They must, look, they are now outflanked by the Russians in Syria. The Russians are north of them, the Russians are south of them. They have issues with the Russians in Azerbaijan and Armenia. Look, the nice meeting with Putin, but I don't think that Turkey is now going to switch alliances in Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. There are other conflicts around Turkey as well. So I guess this, just like Netanyahu is trying to be nice to Putin, this was Erdogan's way too of trying to get the best of the situation, which is not so unpredictable if you look back at the matrix of Turkish foreign policy. To what extent would it try to raise the ante of tension with Greece or with violent actions? It's hard for me to tell, but But if I were the Secretary General of NATO, this would give me something to do in the coming days.
You referred to Israeli vital interest in southern Syria and Turkey's vital interest in northern Syria. And your remark was you don't...
Syria is big enough for both of us.
But there is a problem in Afrin. If the Turks continue to the east, and if President Trump withdraws or does not involve American military power in a larger scale, the Kurdish leadership will have a dilemma. because the only solution to stop the Turks will be to come in terms with Assad and with Iran. This is not a concern for Israel.
It is, but there's very little that Israel can do to prevent it. Israel is not going to deploy its own forces in northern Syria, and so it's more like something to watch, because I don't see Turkish forces ever going down all the way to Aleppo or Damascus or the Israeli border, and Israel has major concern of Iranian deployment, and Israel is trying to draw. The Israeli diplomatic effort is aimed at drawing a red line to prevent, not to be crossed by Iran or by Iranian proxies. I think the first bargaining position was, 50 kilometers away from the Israeli border, which the Iranians reject. But this is similar to the way Israel and Syria divided spheres of interest in Lebanon back in the 70s, and which was kept despite the war of 1982. No, it was north of that, Zahrani River. But Israel saw. Look, Israel saw the Syrian air defense deployment in Lebanon as casus belli, and eventually went to war and destroyed it. And if this ever happens again, then I would start worrying. And I mention it because the Russians made a point of announcing that Israel bombed Syria the last time through Lebanese airspace. So would these new air defense systems protect just the airspace of Syria or also the airspace of Lebanon? What does that mean for the Israeli margin of security? And so Israel is trying to base a red line for Iran in southern Syria. And it's going to be a major point of contention. But I don't think that it has anything to do with Turkish involvement in northern Syria. And with the Kurds turning to Assad, look, it happened before. They know Assad's phone number.
If we can change subject, let's talk a little bit about the Greek-Israeli relationship. After Mavi Marmara, everything changed.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you, why do you believe that Turkey chose to do such a reaction with Mavi Marmara, if they had calculated what was going to happen, and if you believe that this new policy of Greece, Cyprus and Israel triangle cooperation, I would say, not alliance, is something stable with a vision?
Why? Well, to the Turks, I think it was both an issue of national dignity, which is very important to them, but also Erdogan's way of telling Israel that the old Kemalist Israeli alliance is over and that he has a different approach to regional affairs. Obviously, it took several weeks for the Israeli and Greek leaders to exchange visits that never happened for 62 years before that. And since then, it's an ongoing love affair with, it's the same Israeli leader, but Greek leadership obviously was changed. And you have two leaders who come from very, very different, as far apart ideologically, backgrounds as you can think of as Tsipras and Netanyahu. Exchanging phone calls and meetings and visits, and Israeli IDF training in Greece and Cyprus, and the Greek Air Force participating in both Air Force drills and in the air parade, in the air show in the Israeli Independence Day. This was unthinkable, not just unpredictable. You're talking about unpredictable foreign policy. In this case, the Greek foreign policy was even more unpredictable. That for 60 years you had one policy and then you switch alliances. Look, the basis for cooperation is there. And I don't see any reason why this would change anytime soon. But it can always turn back. And clearly there is no... for many European governments, the way of dealing with Israel is to have the best bilateral relations, especially in areas of security, intelligence, defense deals, etc. And then delegating, outsourcing the criticism of occupation and settlements and human rights issues and the Palestinian issue to Brussels. This is very convenient, and as long as Brussels is there, you can keep playing the same game. Because I don't think that look, we don't know I haven't read the minutes of the conversations between Netanyahu and Tsipras, but something tells me that it's not about Tsipras giving Netanyahu a lecture about Gaza or about the settlements, or Netanyahu giving him a lecture about the 2,000 years of Jewish exile and yearning for Palestine and how the Bible said that this was the Jewish land. And which Erdogan was not willing to play that game like his predecessor and like himself in his first years in office. But can it change? Of course it can change. But I don't see any reason why this would change in the foreseeable future. But regional and superpower dynamics can change many things.
The floor is yours. If you want to put some questions, please.
Yeah, just one question. You talked about the financial independence for the Haaretz. Now, if you take circulation and ads together, doesn't add up. Where is the rest of the money coming from?
Well, unpredictably, it does add up. For several years now, we went through a crisis around the time when I took over as editor-in-chief 7 years ago. We went through a crisis. We laid off many people. We got some investment from Leonid Nevzlin, and who bought 20% stake in the paper. But since then, we've been balanced and even making a small profit. You have to, all the time have to worry about your cost structure. For example, we outsourced our delivery, our circulation, to a bigger company, actually to a competitor. And the cost structure of the newsroom is also changing today. We rely much more on freelancers and bloggers and people who have like other jobs as professors and so on than ever before. So it's not just, and we're able to sell new subscriptions to our digital products and to our weekend print section. It's not, we're not Amazon or Google or Facebook, but we are able to reach out to more people. And clearly look, all of us have to deal with the move of readers from print to digital. But the existence of a strong print edition gives you the buffer time to develop your digital product, to educate the audience, to pay for digital products. Advertising is more of a problem because in the digital world, you cannot compete seriously with Google and Facebook. You can get, pennies from people who want to publish their ads in your website for whatever reason. It's a struggle, but it only keeps your job more interesting.
Kalimera, we welcome you here in Greece. I would like to ask you if you believe that a war accident could happen.
That what?
War accident could happen. Accident. I'm not sure. In the Aegean Sea or in Cyprus by the Turks. What's your opinion?
As I said, I'm not really familiar with enough of the details to give you an educated assessment. By intuition, I don't think so. Mostly because if your goal is to be jingoistic to your voters, you can achieve that without taking too much risk and go to war. But I could not. But I don't really want to bet on it. there are mechanisms to prevent it. It's not Israel and Iran with no channels of communication, no regional or European alliance that they are part of, and so on. So there are mechanisms to prevent such an incident. It's not 100 years ago here.
Other question? Yes.
Anybody else?
I will start with an anecdote. The war is led by the Israelis, and the Greeks lead the Israelis. So the real leaders of the war are those who created the Olympic Games, and they united the world, okay? So I have a proposal to you, why we do not promote the unification, like the European Union, of the Eastern Mediterranean countries with the initiative of Israel, which is a leading country. So how do you see if I undertake the proposal to make a kind of Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean Union of all this region and stop the wars?
Very positive.
This was the idea of the late Shimon Peres when he was the foreign minister about 25 years ago, when he wrote the book, The New Middle East. And after that, he suggested, and he promoted and to some extent succeeded in creating organs like a regional bank, like regional economic conferences that were held once in Casablanca and then in Amman in 1995. And then at some point he suggested that Israel should join the Arab League and turn it from an Arab League to the Middle Eastern League.
Yes.
The problem was that these ideas were seen both in the Israeli public opinion, but even more so by Arab public opinion, as either fantasies, or the main adversary of these ideas at the time was Amr Moussa, the former Egyptian foreign secretary. And Moussa argued that this is a kind of Israeli colonial policy that, rather than occupying Arab territories by force, occupying Arab economies by its economic advantage. So when the peace process was derailed after the Rabin assassination and the Netanyahu takeover, none of these institutions ever came about. I think the only one remaining, correct me if I'm wrong, there is the regional water center in Oman, which still exists, and you still have Israeli scientists and engineers and scientists from the Arab world, from the Sunni Arab world. I don't think there are Syrians there or Lebanese or Iranians, definitely. But that's the only thing that still exists from this regional approach. Can it ever come back? Yes, it can. But in order to achieve that, you need to first solve the bilateral issues and the Palestinian issue first and foremost. You cannot build. There are those politicians in Israel who argue that rather than deal directly with the Palestinians who are divided and irresponsible and reckless, then you should approach the bigger Arab states, and that they would deliver Palestinian agreement to whatever accord. But experience has shown that if you don't resolve these bilateral issues, you cannot just start a regional approach. And in Europe too, the regional approach came only when the Germans and French were too tired and fatigued by centuries of fighting. And they had the American superpower protecting them.
We have time for one more question only, please.
Πίσω σου, κύριος.
Hello. Thanks for coming and sharing all this stuff with us. I'd like to ask about the settlements outside the Israeli borders. do you think constant expansion of them will eventually allow for some advancement in the peace process?
Clearly, these settlements are expanded in order to prevent the partition of the land and the creation of a Palestinian state there. So no, it's not helpful to reaching peace based on the two-state solution. This is clear, and the leaders of the settler movement don't argue the opposite. Only they think that this would save Israel, and I think that this is against Israeli self-interest. But this is big debate in Israel. I would say the mainstream opinion is that Israel would stick to the settlement blocks that are closer to the pre-67 border, and that this would be eventually part of Israel in any future deal, and that Israel should not build in the far-flung settlements. The far right in Israel argues the opposite, that since the blocks are going to be there anyway, Israel should develop the far-flung settlements to prevent a Palestinian state there. And as I said, the Trump administration, despite its wide support of the Netanyahu government, otherwise, on the settlement issue, Trump said publicly more than once, and now we just read a report that he said it privately to Netanyahu as well, that he opposes settlement expansion. And there's very little going on outside the blocks in terms of expansion, without forcing Israel into a formal freeze as Obama did. Or in other words, Trump and Netanyahu are trying to reach understanding that without breaking Netanyahu's coalition, without making it politically impossible for Netanyahu. But the short answer is yes, the settlements are a problem for peacemaking.
I would like to thank you, dear colleague. I think that all of us quite now are more rich concerning our acknowledgement about the developments in Israel, in the Palestinian region, etc. Speaking as the president of Athens News Agency, thank you very much for coming here. Thanks all the colleagues for the participation, of course all of you. Athens Macedonian News Agency will continue to present such events with distinguished journalists from all over the world. Thank you again. It was a great honor to be here with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.